Today we're going to take an enormous cultural jump from communities that could not be more different. One that was, as I said yesterday, overwhelmingly secular. Today I'm going to speak about a group in Israel that are called ultra-Orthodox. The Hebrew word for it, which I will use because they use it and everyone uses it to describe them, is Haredim. I know you can't pronounce it, but it doesn't matter. Haredim meaning the fearful, or more loosely, those who fear God. For many years now, my wife and I have been traveling, 8-9 times already, to a university in the center of China, Haojang University. And I have been asked multiple times, but when we see Jews on television, they're all bearded, wearing big black hats and sidelocks. Where are you from? How do you fit into this picture? Then I need to start explaining. And the explanation begins with the statement that the ultra-Orthodox Haredi part of Israeli society is only about 9%. But if you were to go from Kiev in the year 1800, 100 kilometers in each direction, as far as Białystok and Lodz and Lomże and Krakow, all Jews would have looked that way, more or less. So the ultra-Orthodox are continuing a tradition that has been mostly abandoned. They are keeping up forms of dress, according to scholars, that are like what Polish nobles, particularly the fur hat, what Polish nobles wore in the 18th century. Whether that's true or not doesn't really matter. Their dress is not modern. But today, 91% do dress in the modern style. How did that happen? The most important thing that happened was in the 19th century when the Enlightenment, whose home was basically in France, moved to Eastern and Central Europe, and a Jewish Enlightenment, parallel to the Les Lumières, the era of the Enlighteners like Voltaire, Rousseau, Diderot, etc., moved into the Jewish world, particularly in Middle and Eastern Europe, and attacked the old ideas as being overly traditional, superstitious, obscurantist, and worse. These people try to create a new form of enlightened Judaism, so that at the beginning of the 19th century, Reform Judaism begins, which is much more progressive, gender equal, etc. And they began to perceive of being Jewish on the basis of what they saw around them. that is Christianity. Christianity is a religion and not an ethnic group. And so these early reformers said, no, we are of the faith of Moses, as the French say, but there is no Jewish nation. There is no Jewish ethnicity. The Haskalah, or Enlightenment, entered Jewish life very profoundly. So that even in Vilnius, before the Second World War, there were more enlighteners than there were students at yeshivas, at Jewish Talmudic institutes. This Enlightenment, of course, the same thing happened to Christianity after Martin Luther's Reformation. The Catholics then dug their feet into the ground and they said, no, we are not changing. The Jewish religious traditional world said the same thing. And it is then that the word orthodox appears. The word was not used beforehand. Orthodox, the right opinion, or the Provoslav, the right opinion, the straight opinion. You go to a dentist who is what's it called? Orthodontist to make your teeth straight, right? There was also, of course, the great tragedy. The yeshiva world that did survive this Haskalah underwent total destruction virtually during the Holocaust. There were all the great yeshivot from Vilna to Slobodka to etc. were destroyed. And with it, the pride of Jewish culture, or some of Jewish culture, Talmudic traditional study. So that when the war was over, the survivors who came to Israel equaled somewhere between 35 and 50,000 people. A drop of those who were once the Harvard and Yale of the Jewish world. But I just said they were 9% of Israeli Jewish population, which equals, well, 600 some odd thousand. What happened? Their population grew exponentially, enormously, beyond anything that anyone had ever perceived of. By the way, very much the same thing happened in the United States, where those who survived the Holocaust and rather than going to the Holy Land decided to go to New York, a small Haredi core grew into today a population that is roughly 550,000 ultra-Orthodox Jews in America. Ultra-Orthodoxy, Haredi Judaism has been reborn. Much like the legendary phoenix, it has risen from the ashes. In fact, I think it's an historical, incontrovertible fact that there are more people studying Torah today than ever before in all of Jewish history, including the eras before the war and certainly the eras going back to the Talmudic period. that is about 2,000 years ago. Haredim attribute this rebirth, of course, to divine intervention. God willed it. On the other hand, let us come down to earth a bit more. Most sociologists believe that it would not have been possible, this exponential growth, were it not for the fact that Israel has a very generous welfare system that, as we shall see, pays families for having many children. And this burgeoning growth demographically was supported in many ways by providing families with many children, budgets, sustenance, all forms of services. Neither can we overlook in this rebirth the fact that there were any number of charismatic ultra-Orthodox leaders who inspired their flock, their believers, and created the trajectory, the enthusiasm that so many of these newly born Haredim have for the religion. Let me stop for a moment and tell you about an experience that I had here in Ukraine a day or two ago. We are staying at the hotel that is right near the synagogue. The synagogue, I'm sure many of you know. There's a hotel there. It's an ultra-Orthodox hotel. And when I spoke to some of the people, I started out in Yiddish, because when I see someone like that, the language would clearly be Yiddish, but they didn't understand a word. And the little children were playing in Ukrainian. This did not make any cultural sense to me, but it turns out that here too, after 1989, many Ukrainian Jews, for reasons that I do not understand to this point, underwent this kind of transition to become not only modern Orthodox Jews, but ultra-Orthodox Jews in the most extreme forms that I know. I do not know of any other example that I've ever heard of such a dramatic shift. Remember, 1989 was less than 30 years ago, and here they have a community that is ultra-Orthodox. The Haredim in Israel feel a sense of triumph. This is what sociologists sometimes call triumphalism. This sense that history is on their side, God is on their side, and they are winning. The community of Haredim in Israel is already in charge of a great deal of Israeli education and penetrating more and more as religious parties are in the government. They own almost completely the entire kashrut, kosher certification business in the country. They have networks of charity and philanthropy. They control most cemeteries and so on. Current demographic estimates say that the number of Haredim in the world is somewhat in excess of 1 million. Somewhat. Although they represent less than 10% of Israel's population, they are far and away the fastest growing cohort in the country. Their birth rate is 3 times the size of the average average secular woman in the country. Secular Jewish women have about 2.123 children. They have average families of about 7 children. One critical fact is that the average age of the Haredi in Israel is 20.5 years. In Israel, non-Haredim are 35.5, and in Germany it's 46. So you get a sense of how quickly they are growing. While 85% of Haredim are married in Israel, only 60% of the general Jewish Israeli population is married. They have, for the very most part, succeeded in building a wall between themselves and the Western world, Western values. I said for the most part, because I'm going to go back and explain where the cracks in the wall nevertheless exist. 7 children per family. First of all, imagine that logistically. If you have an apartment of 2 rooms or 3 rooms with 7 children, and since they do not use birth control, their ages generally are 2, 3, 4, 5, with no big separation between them. And please do the arithmetic with me. If you have a family of 7 children, and these 7 children have 7 children, and the 49 of them now have 7 children, 2 parents in 3 generations will reach 343 people. So you get a sense of this growth in demography. Haredim, by current predictions, will double their population every 17 years. More than 20% of children entering the 1st grade are Haredi. That is enormous, and given the exponential growth, will no doubt grow over the years. And again, when Haredim look back at where they came from, destruction, and a few remnants here and there, they can only feel this sense of triumph that I mentioned a while ago. Non-Orthodox Jews, secular Jews, although they are very resentful of the Haredim, for many reasons I will explain, nevertheless have a certain romantic idealization of them as somehow an anchor into the real Jewish past. they romanticize them. They idealize them, although in many ways they hate them. One of perhaps the greatest Hebrew poet of modern Hebrew, his name was Chaim Nachman Bialik, wrote a poem that every child in school will read. And it begins, if you truly want to know what the secret of Jewish longevity is, go to the yeshiva, into the study hall, and there you will find in the corner this pale young man sitting over a tractate of Talmud 24 hours a day or as long as he needs to sleep in between. He, this assiduous student, Bialik writes, is the heart of Jewish longevity, of Jewish long-term existence. Now a bit about the sociology. Haredim are divided into three different groups. I think it is fair to say that there are virtually no strict historical laws. Everything tends to change, but there is one historical law that I will bet on, that a religion founded in unity will invariably split apart into very many different groups with different beliefs and so on. I think that that is a universal historical rule. The Haredim are divided into three different groups. They are called the Lithuanians, even though some of them came from Belarus and other places. The Hasidim, normally the press, the media refers to all of them as Hasidim when they are not. And the third group are those who are spoken of as Sfaradim. Sepharad is the way you say Spain in Hebrew, and this ultra-Orthodox group are those who were expelled from Spain in 1492 and spread across mostly North Africa, some in the Balkans, etc. These are Sephardic Jews, but there were Jews who lived in Baghdad and Tehran and other places who were not part of those who were expelled. There was a thriving Jewish community in Baghdad or in Mesopotamia, then called Babylon, that wrote most of the Talmud in the 4th, 5th, 6th century of the Common Era. Now let me say a word about each of these groups, because that will be critical in our discussion. Let's say the original, the earliest, leaving the Sephardim apart for a moment, were the Lithuanians. They were based on yeshiva training that was mostly Talmudic in character, rational, legal, hard-thinking, philosophical characteristics. But then, about 1730, 1740, a young man who was buried not very far away from Kiev, I was trying to catch the name, but I thought Medjuris.
Medjugorje?
Probably, that sounds right. His name, he was called the Baal Shem Tov, the master of the good name, and he opposed this entire approach to Judaism. He didn't reject orthodoxy, he was an entirely Orthodox Jew, but he emphasized a Judaism that grew out of the heart. A good Jewish, religious, decent person was a simple person, not one who could spin an argument and win it simply by cleverness. He founded the movement called Hasidism. Hasid means someone who has grace or someone who's a fine person. The Hasidic movement won out culturally in much of Eastern Europe, except for Lithuania and some of the surrounding areas. The Hasidim were, not surprisingly, rejected by the Lithuanian Talmudic, yeshiva-centered world. They thought of them as a mass of superstitious pietists, that is, someone who just thought religion was a matter of the heart and not a matter of knowledge. That was a wild overstatement, but nevertheless, that was the general idea. Now, let's go on to the Sephardic Jews. Israel invented a word. Sephardic Jews are those, as I said, who were expelled from Spain. But then again, I also mentioned Jews from Babylon, etc., who had nothing to do with the Spanish expulsion. So modern Hebrew developed a new word, Mizrachim they were called, translated either Eastern Jews or Oriental Jews for reasons that I do not understand because they had nothing to do with the Orient. And the Sephardic Jews were very different in many ways from Jews who grew up in Europe, Eastern Europe. I mentioned the Haskalah, the Jewish Enlightenment, which caused a counter-reaction on the part of the Orthodox against this Haskalah, which created enormous tensions between the two groups. Those who were moving in the direction of free thinking, science, doubt, literature. There were no novels written in the yeshiva. And in North Africa and in the East, Babylonia, Syria, etc., to Iran, they did not have an Haskalah. There was no emancipation that streamed through North Africa and challenged orthodoxy. So that, interestingly, those who had even lost their faith were not part of a movement. They did not create their own community, and they certainly did not criticize traditional Sephardi religious culture. They were part of the community, and they gave to the community funds, and the rabbis were respected. but they were not terribly religious in their own terms. Hence, what happened was that Sephardic Jews never had this clash, and as a result, they have settled on a form of Judaism that is traditional and inclusive of all of those in their community, as opposed to the Lithuanians or the Hasidim, who have enemies who want to reject their views. The Haredi, and now I'm using the term once again generically to include all of them, are fundamentally pre-modern in their point of view. They are strongly opposed to the most basic Western democratic liberal ideas, such as the autonomy of the individual, the ability of every person to choose the life that they see fit, and of course, gender equality is out of the question. There is no, or very little, cultural diversity, and certainly no, or very little, ideological pluralism in this world. For our purposes, talking about Israel, Haredim are profoundly anti-Zionist. They think that Zionism is the collective modern sin of the Jewish people. Some even go so far as to make the ghastly suggestion that the Holocaust came about because of the Enlightenment and of Zionism. They are anti-Zionist, not because they support the Palestinian cause, but because they think that nationalism, Jewish nationalism, is an affront to God. Only God will return his people to his country. The Messiah will come one day, and this is not something that human beings should force. We are not pushing history. We are waiting for history to happen to us. And the idea of aggressive nationalism, which Zionism certainly was, aggressive nationalism, a Jewish national liberation movement, was for them absolutely an abomination. And hence, Zionism for them, the Jewish state for them, is a fundamental historical error. They are very different in this from the modern Orthodox Jews, who are some 12% of Israel's population. They dress in modern fashion, but they will wear a kippah, a skull cap, and women sometimes will, sometimes won't, cover the head with a kerchief. Now, the modern Orthodox are the ones who are leading the settlement project. The Haredim want nothing to do with the settlement project because it is, once again, pushing history and not waiting for God to do it. One caveat, because Haredi areas are very densely populated, there are a number of settlements just across the Green Line where they go because they have nowhere else to go. But the idea of settling, of forcing aggressively the pace of history, they do not believe that. While the modern Orthodox, sometimes called national religious, sometimes called religious Zionists, believe that the state of Israel, the state itself, is holy. It is the vehicle of redemption. And hence the state has for them a religious status. There were some very central in this modern Zionist movement who thought of tanks and airplanes in the Jewish army as having a kind of holiness because they were the force of God in history. The Haredi community is unique, probably in the world, in one belief and practice. They live in what they call the learning, quote, learning society. Israel has been founded. We are no longer under the boot of the non-Jews. We are not a minority any longer. And now what we need to do is to study Torah without stop. That is our revenge against Hitler. That pokes Hitler in the eyes. And so this community instructs all men, not women, of course, only men, to spend their lives studying Torah. Not to work gainfully, not to join the labor market, not to make a living, as they say, but rather to study Torah all their lifetimes. Not all Haredim obey this command of the rabbis, but about 60% of them do. And they do not work, quote, for money. They say they work in the yeshiva protecting Jewish existence, but they do not work for money. Now, again, if the father is not working and there are 7 children in the house to support, say at the beginning when there are 2 or 3 children, the wife can go out and work and bring home some kind of salary. Not very much, because the women are not trained in anything that would give them a good salary. But at the beginning, the wife can work. But when you have 6 or 7 children running around the house, the wife cannot work either. Now, this seems impossible. How can that be? Well, the answer is what I said right at the beginning. Israel's very generous program to support people just like them. The Haredim are the poorest single community within Jewish Israel, perhaps even poorer than Israeli Arabs. Perhaps. It's a toss-up. The rabbis continually say that a life spent in business and the professions is a lesser life than those who study Torah, which is the highest form of life, the one that realizes the person most profoundly. And of course, apart from the high principle that one should study Torah one's entire life, over the years, many interests have developed over this. The rabbis have interests in it continuing. The yeshivot, the Talmudic academies have it. The kashrut, the kosher certifiers have it. All the families who receive these generous payments have interest. So it is a matter of principle, but it is a matter of practice as well. A very famous historian, an English historian, beginning of the 20th century, wrote a book called The Invention of Tradition. Certain people simply invent traditions that never have existed in the past. And this, living in poverty, studying Torah for a full lifetime, is something that has never happened before in all of Jewish history. There were no learning societies in the past. At very best, a Jewish community, say a small shtetl not far from here, there would be 1, 2, 3, 10 prodigies who the community would support so that they could continue studying. But as a general rule, it flies in the face of Jewish tradition in the most brutal and blunt way. For example, the Talmud, I'm just going to quote here, "He who does not teach his son," speaking to the father, "he who does not teach his son a trade, it is as if he taught him robbery." And perhaps the greatest commentary on the Bible and Talmud, whose name was Rashi, Rabbi Shlomo Yitzchaki, who lived 11 something, I don't remember the dates exactly, glosses this Talmudic passage and says, "He will be hungry and become a highwayman," or a robber. The greatest of all medieval Jewish scholars, Maimonides, first of all, he worked. He was a doctor to the king, to many other people when he moved all around North Africa. And he said, he was even more insistent, he writes, "To study Torah at the public expense scorns the religion of Israel, and that person will not be granted entrance into the next world." But the invention of tradition is such a powerful force that somehow those sentences, when they study the Torah, sort of their eyes glaze over and they go on to the next sentence. So we have this problem of poverty, intense poverty among the Haredim. It's not only that they are poor, but they ghettoize. They live together in homogeneous enclaves, in homogeneous ghettos. In Israel, there are parts of Jerusalem that are 100% Haredi. Coming to my neck of the woods, that is closer to Tel Aviv, there is a town called Bnei Brak, which is also 100% ultra-Orthodox. My wife recalls when we first came to Israel, walking around Bnei Brak and asking how to get from one place to another. The man said, well, you turn right on Moses, our father, then you turn right on Rabbi Akiva, and you turn left again on some other Maimonides streets. So the world that they live in is totally enclosed. The same is true, by the way, for American ultra-Orthodox who live in certain concentrated areas, mostly in Brooklyn, New York. The great challenge of the Haredi world is keeping the West out. And do you know what the greatest weapon that the West has? I think all of you have it in your pocket or your purse, a cell phone. Because with a cell phone, you can look for news, look for articles. Sorry, you can even look for pornography. And this digital Trojan horse, to mix historical metaphors, that is threatening parts of the Haredi world. It is no secret and no surprise then that the rabbis, there are signs, posters all over. Smartphones are absolutely forbidden. If you see a Haredi with a phone in his hand, it will be a dumb phone. That is, the phone that cannot do anything except for make a phone call. But this is almost an impossible situation. There are things that simply depend, for example, driving somewhere without a GPS if you don't know where you're going. So inevitably, by need, it tends to seep in. The story of the Haredi with the smartphone under his mattress may or may not be exactly true, but it certainly indicates the direction. Now, although they do not want the entrance of Western values, it's interesting that they love what it can do to make their lives easier. They are not like the Amish in America who won't drive. They drive, they fly in airplanes, they go to modern hospitals, etc., etc. They will use Western culture, science, deliberately without, looking to what lies behind it. Science, doubt, etc. The Haredi world then wants the fruits of Western civilization, but it does not want its values. And exactly the same thing is true about its relationship to the state of Israel. It depends on what the Israeli state can do for them, which they accept with open arms, but they do not accept the state of Israel itself. So they have this very instrumental and complex relationship to the state. For years, certainly at the beginning, the founding of the state, the Haredim spoke of themselves as an almost extinct civilization that had to be forcibly kept together. Their image was a lamb surrounded by 70 wolves. As a result, they decided to do all they could to keep the West out. This sense of being a persecuted small minority has of late become impossible to sustain. The words are spoken, but they don't believe it. They are no longer lambs and the rest of the country a wolf. They have become politically terribly important. They control so much of Israeli life. And in some cases, they are enormously powerful. I don't know how many of you may have heard of one particular sect of the Hasidic Jews called Chabad, the Tier, Lubavitch. It is an organization, the rabbi of whom died about 20 years ago, 25 years ago, and they believe, I think these are the only Jews in the world who believe in the resurrection, that the rabbi is coming back and he will liberate the world. But meanwhile, we have to do whatever we can to bring Jews back to Judaism, which equals ultra-Orthodox Judaism. They have branches in 90 countries in the world, hundreds and hundreds of different organizations. All I need to do is tell you that after the army, Israeli ex-soldiers tend to take a trip far away, and it's usually to the east, to India and Nepal, etc., because it's very cheap. And in Kathmandu, what place could be more remote than Kathmandu? On Passover, Chabad has a Passover Seder there in which there are 1,500 about Israelis who come to Kathmandu to celebrate the Passover Seder. So this old image of themselves being surrounded, as they were in Europe, this old image is dying. They speak of themselves often as living in a diaspora in the Jewish state. They speak of the country as a curse, as an abomination, but nevertheless, they live on its fruits. Again, returning to poverty, because that in some ways gets to the heart of their power. About 50% of those who are poor by Israel's standards are Haredi. Although they go through many, many years of study, many more than non-Haredi Jews in Israel, they emerge from this education with no skills that are usable outside the yeshiva. Imagine a scholar, a profound scholar, who thinks of himself as a great scholar, and everyone around him honors him as a great scholar. Imagine what happens to this person when he decides, I need to make a living, I need to leave the yeshiva world. What can they do? Virtually nothing. There's a worse problem, because if you receive government support, you're not permitted to work. So that many of them, and this is a true humiliation, work in jobs that you get money in cash, that is the black market. They work as waiters in catering factories and all that, but they can't get a job. I have a student this year. Well, let me start from the beginning. Israel demands, as a law, the Ministry of Education demands that there be a core curriculum that every student in Israel has to undergo. And it includes the obvious things: mathematics, English, computers, Hebrew, history, civics. Most of the Haredi schools do not teach these subjects. They will get a smattering of very basic arithmetic, but beyond that, they are not educated. So this student came up to me at the beginning of this academic year, and it's a seminar in which they need to write a paper, and he tells me, and I can see from his dress, I have just left the Haredi world. And I must tell you that I do not know a word of English. How am I possibly going to write a seminar paper when at least a third of the sources have to be in English? So this puts them at an enormous disadvantage, and they cannot move into the general world because they have no marketable skills. How do they do this? How do they get away with taking the fruits of the country, all this money that's given to them, not teach the subjects, etc.? To understand this question is to go to politics, because they have a profound lever, a leverage, traction against the Israeli government. There's one other issue which is probably the most explosive of all, that divides Israel between the Haredim on one side and everyone else, except for the Arabs, of course, but everyone else in the country. And this includes the modern Orthodox. Everyone opposes them. This goes back to a story that is very well known in Israel. After the state was founded, David Ben-Gurion, the founder, the first prime minister of the state of Israel, had a well-publicized meeting with the man who was the head of the Haredi community, a great, great scholar, and they sat down together and talked about what's going to happen. This man, the Chazon Ish, his name was, said, David, listen, how many people are studying Torah today? 400. The entire yeshiva world has been destroyed. There are 400 left. Let us agree that these 400 do not have to serve in the army. Let them study and not be taken up with other issues. Ben-Gurion agreed. 400, what kind of a difference does that make? Today, there are tens of thousands who do not serve in the army. And this infuriates most Israelis who do serve in the army. They say they're protecting Israel as much as any soldier because they're keeping its soul alive. But army people say, listen, sitting on a bench in the study hall is nothing like sitting on the battlefield and risking your life. So this has become the great cause célèbre, the great issue that divides the Haredi and non-Haredi world in the most violent way sometimes. As when a Haredi young man receives a draft notice to which he does not respond, the police come and all hell breaks loose. The Haredim fight the police, set fire to trash cans. There are scenes every other week of these violent confrontations between them. How do they get away with this? And here we turn to politics, where their political power derives from. Israel's Knesset, its parliament, has 120 members, which means that to form a coalition, you need at least 61 members. The Haredi parties today have 13 seats. Now take a calculation that's very oversimplified. The Likud can get as much as, well, 30 seats in the parliament. Add another few right-wing parties, and you get to 50, 51, 52. How do you form a coalition? The only way is to invite Haredi parties to enter the coalition, and they become the pivot of the coalition. Without them, coalitions are sometimes impossible. What's even more outstanding is that in cases when the secular center-left parties win the election, exactly the same logic applies. So you can have secular social democrats who have no choice but to include the ultra-orthodox into the coalition, which means that they have their hand on the spigot, on the faucet of the money the government spends. The most wanted position of these Haredi politicians is to be the head of the finance committee in the Knesset. Because as head of the finance committee, they can decide to send money here, to spend money there. They even can decide which of the branches, Lithuanians, Sephardic, Hasidim, get the money. So here is the critical point. Because of this political coalitional necessity, the Haredi population is able to do things that seem undoable. They can receive an enormous amount of money. Parenthetically, it has been calculated that about 2/3 of the population of these families with 7 children comes directly or indirectly from the community chest, from the government. They can defy the Ministry of Education and not teach the core subjects, which means their population is condemned to poverty. Let me just stop for 1 second and say, this is not poverty that is forced upon them. This is self-imposed poverty. This is voluntary poverty. They say God will help, but again, they choose to be poor. And choosing not to work also means choosing not to pay taxes, so that you have a certain part of the Israeli population, 9–10%, that do not pay taxes and are given large handouts. This as opposed to the genuinely poor, those who truly need improvement in education, social services, infrastructure, etc. The money is being sidetracked, siphoned off to their community, while other very worthwhile causes are not being done at all. There is another form of resentment. I'm trying to build here a portrait of why Israelis as a whole, despite the romanticization that I spoke of at the beginning, are deeply resentful of the Haredi world. They are very right-wing in their politics. Yesterday I spoke of people from the former Soviet Union who, although their Jewishness was not really important to them, turned to the right. The Haredim, although they're anti-Zionist, also turned to the right, just as the national modern Orthodox do. So when we walked around Kiev this afternoon and we saw hundreds of people, I had no way of distinguishing between him and her about what their politics are. You just don't see it. In Israel, if you walk around and you see someone who is a Haredi, someone who is wearing a kippah, a woman with a scarf, you eyeball them. You just look at them and you know what their politics are. And this creates alienation, of course, of another kind. And then there is patriarchy, the lack of equality between men and women. And much of what I'm going to say now will seem to you, well, it comes from Fiddler on the Roof. It comes from a world that no longer exists. All traditions going back a century or two were patriarchal. There are very few that were not. And the Jewish tradition is one of them. But the Jewish tradition has modernized, and today there is more or less gender equality in Israel. But the Haredim do not accept this. For example, I will give just one or two small examples. In the last 2 or 3 decades, bus lines operating between different Haredi residential areas separate between men and women, so that men sit in the front and women sit in the back. Why do men sit in the front and women in the back? Gender, it could be the opposite, because in the Haredi view, men are sexual predators. They are full of lust. Women have virtually no sex drive. So, if men sit in the back, they'd be looking at women, which they do not accept. To make this short, there is even one section in Jerusalem, the closest, most enclavic group, that rabbis are demanding that women walk on one side of the street and men walk on another side. It has not happened yet, but there is truly talk of it. In weddings, there are times, Haredi weddings, where the men sit in one room and the women sit in a different room. This patriarchal system, as you can imagine, takes a lot of energy to keep in place. And yet, the power of the modern world is very difficult to resist. There are the start of Haredim going to the university. Their condition for going to the university is that they study in gender-separate classrooms. And the universities, happy to get the Haredim out of their world and give them marketable skills, go along. There's a lot of criticism, but it is happening. Some Haredim are now beginning to serve in the army. Some, very few, but some. But, on the other hand, there are very few marriages between Haredim and non-Haredim. Very few Haredim have non-Haredi friends. 20% of the Haredi population says that they are not part of Israeli society. Perhaps the most critical, obvious instance in which the Haredim have not been able to toe the line was that at the start of Israel's existence, the Haredim said, we will not speak Hebrew. Hebrew is the holy tongue. It is meant for prayer and study, etc. And we will come back to speak it in the Messianic era. Today, we speak only Yiddish. That no longer exists. The power of Hebrew became so intense that today you virtually will not find a Haredi who either speaks Hebrew on a daily basis or understands Hebrew very well. Just go on because I see the time is running short. Haredim do not oppose democracy. Note that I said this in the negative. They do not oppose democracy. It is not the form of government that they want. That will need to wait for the Messiah. which will then be a Torah state. But now we can't do that, and to quote Winston Churchill's famous crack, democracy is the worst form of government except for all the others. So they will accept democracy because it helps them, it allows them to get money, it allows them to live a successful life, successful religious life. I'd like to summarize very briefly, because I've been going from one side to the other, trying to present what is a really complex reality. On one side, there are no clear symptoms or indications that Haredi society is going to change in a dramatic way anytime soon. It is true that about 1 in 10 Haredim leave the Haredi fold, but if you have 7 children, that is a small number overwhelmed by the new generations. Although the digital revolution has made an enormous impact, the Haredi rabbinate is still holding it at bay. They do this, first of all, by insisting on dumb phones, and more interestingly, if someone buys a computer, which in the past was absolutely prohibited, it is installed, a program is installed in the computer which does not allow going to any but approved sites. You can go to Torah sites, but you can't read the newspaper. I mentioned already the great difficulty for them serving in the army. This does not look like it will be changing anytime soon. And although certain are going to higher education, this is a trickle and not a wave. Women are working more and more because of necessity, and this does, in a small way, guarantee a little more gender equality, because if a woman comes home with the check, she has a certain amount of power, but patriarchy still holds. They are fighting, and mostly winning, the struggle against Israelization, becoming like other Israelis. It is true that you will see Haredi families in shopping malls, something that never could have been in the past. You can see Haredi families walking in nature on holidays, something, again, that was unthinkable in the past. And although some at the margins agree that the learning society is unsustainable, it has its own filter, its own faults within it. How did Marx say? It creates its own gravediggers. It can't have 60% of males not working and rely on the government to make up the difference. Nevertheless, despite what seems to me an obvious truth, they hold it at bay. There is unlikely, at least now, to be any change in their coalitional power. There will be new elections in the spring, caused, Netanyahu said, by the fact that they could not pass a law relating to Haredim serving in the army. It's been a football back and forth, serve in the army, don't serve in the army, etc. Israel has never been able to pass a law that would do the very obvious thing of saying, okay, the very gifted stay in the yeshiva, all the rest serve. I think this would interest you particularly. Yeshiva students who don't want to go to the army and who aren't really studying in the yeshiva, that is, they're wasting their time wandering around, are called the Shabab. Of all things. The street hoods, you know. Haredim today, again, answer pollsters by saying that they are more Haredi than their parents and their grandparents. And there are a host of new, strict, meticulous, more strict laws that are being passed or in the Haredi mind, limiting and restricting even more. There is no sign that enclavic living, that is living in ghettos, is weakening. I live in a town that is mostly not a normal number of religious persons, but virtually no Haredim. They do not live, for the very most part, in this way. This is a problem that Israel faces. In some ways, at least internally, it's the most explosive issue, but there does not seem on the horizon any way of solving it. Thank you. If there are any questions, I'd be happy to take them. Yes?
I heard that Haredis protects maybe somehow Muslims and Arabs in Israel. Well, in such a way, like maybe they are against Israeli state and Israel, and maybe I am a bit mistaken, but.
Well, you are right in one thing, that they are against the Israeli state. That is true. But that they have any concern about Arab rights? Hardly. No.
I also hear that there is such kind of Jews who support Arabians because they're also being. It's not a lot.
Okay. There is a very tiny group. Yes, I'm talking about tens, 100, who are off the map. One never hears of them except for comedy value. They went in the past to visit Yasser Arafat. They went to international, it's mostly PR, public relations of a small group that has no power and no say. They're marginal, but they get the public eye on television by doing things that for 99.9% of Israeli are outrageous.
Yeah, do they have a name? I mean,
Niturei Karta. Niturei Karta means it's Aramaic. It means the guardians of the city. And they live in very, very small little enclaves within Jerusalem. And if you ever go there, make sure you're wearing, if you're a man, a big hat. And if you're a woman, make sure that your skirts reach near the floor. A hat would help as well. If you walk in there bareheaded, or a woman with shorts and spaghetti straps, I wouldn't vouch for your safety. This is really, just last word, I have a friend, a German friend, who is an anthropologist. And the last day she was about to leave, what can we see beyond the great tourist sites that would make you, that would interest you? So we went to Bnei Baruch, this small enclave. It means leaving the 21st century and going into a different world, the stores sell different products, the clothing is different, people walk around the streets very differently. It's as far as you can move from secular Tel Aviv at 11 o'clock on Friday night as is only possible to imagine. Thank you again. See you tomorrow.